Uh, well, it's what are we, 19 years of taking fruit in this vineyard, and it's perhaps only the last 6 vintages that we confidently say that it's got 8 to 10 years maturing available to it. And for the greater vintages, something like a 15 or even an 18, we'd like to think they'd go further than the 10, and they might even make 20. But there's very few Australian Pinots that you can have confidence in saying, I'm going to sell this for 15 to 20 years and sell a greater wine than we would after sort of 5 to 8.
I reckon I probably get my knickers in a twist about the cellaring thing too much. It's just a case of recalibrating, and especially in a place like Singapore where space is such a problem. I'm not going to live another 30 years with the cellaring space. So I'm these days leaning more and more into a wine that has a sort of 5 to 10 year bracket rather than getting too crazy about long term. Mate, is this all whole bunch, or is it a part whole bunch and part
2017, 50%.
Okay.
50% whole bunch. So Farrside naturally has a savouriness, or this undergrowth sort of characteristic that can give a green character without using stems in the fermentation. So it's an interesting conversation in this day and age, because there's so many people that are using it because of this on-trend characteristic that they want to see. They want to talk about the stem characteristic and what it brings to their wine. And that for me is the question. If anyone starts talking about whole bunch fermentation, what are they trying to achieve by using this technique? And for the Geelong region, we have so much robustness and structure and depth of flavour. It's there to bring finesse. It almost prevents us from over-extracting because of the amount of mass that's within the fermentation. So if you have a destemmed tank of fruit, it's very easy to do pump overs, very easy to do punch downs, and therefore you get a lot of extraction. This way, if you have this green matter in there, it's holding the fruit up. It
actually protects it to a certain degree. Yeah, that's crazy. I'd never thought of it in those terms before. It's actually, it actually encases it a little bit. That's terrific.
If you look at Farrside at 50%, you look at Tout at 100% whole bunch. There comes a point where you find there's an equilibrium between the two, where you see the same amount of bunchy character or herbaceousness throughout the same wines. And there's far more fruit intensity in Tout, but at 100% whole bunch, we can't do any extraction for the first 8 days until the fermentation is actually generating enough heat. Where Farrside, we're able to punch down and through that cap, and therefore you're scraping the skins, you're scraping the stems at a stage where there's a lot of green tannin available. So when people talk about hands-on winemaking, that is definitely a process early on in a fermentation, of whole bunch fermentation. You need to actually be restrained, because it's too easy to extract that green tomato leaf characteristic in the first 8 days.
And then it can become too overt, I guess, as a flavour.
If you don't have the fruit intensity, structure, and acidity to carry that, then you've just lost the point of the vintage and the fruit.
I think the thing that draws me the most to it tonight is possibly that tapenade and savoury components, and maybe also like super bruised cherries, or maybe Kirsch or something like that, as that kind of component that seems to flow so easily over it. I really love it. Anybody with questions on this one before we move to the Tout? None?
Does anyone not see cherries, the sour cherry character? I just put my daughter to bed an hour ago, and she said, "Dad, you smell like cherries."
It's good to hear that the next generation is getting on board early.
So dumplings, had dumplings and cherries.
Excellent. Mate, the Tout, when I do the readings on this, everything about this particular label is challenging. You've got 3 slopes, 3 different soil types. You've gone for the close planting Burgundian vines. What was the inspiration for that? I mean, I'm quite interested as to how you built a wine out of such diverse characteristics. Did you look at them as individual components and say, okay, we can do something with this, or did it sort of determine its own destiny?
Initially, it was because it sits above Farrside, and it's predominantly the black soils that come up from Farrside at the top of the hill, but then it fell away in 3 different directions. And I'd recently been walking through Bonmar, where you see the red and white soils and the contrast within one vineyard. So to walk through Tout, and it literally is, you can draw a line between the break between the red soil with quartz gravel, the black soil with limestone, and the grey soil with buckshot. And initially it was segregated off, and like all great wines, it is greater as a blend, as a wine that was fermented with no comparison between the soil types. It was all put into one fermentation, and the complexities and the elements that it distributed throughout the wine, where it had this characteristic of the black soils is typically about 12.5 potential alcohol with higher acidity. The red soil is about 13, and then the grey soil is about 13.5 to 13.8. So different maturities within 2 acres, and therefore that layering of flavours in the wine, that greater depth of wine, has come from different maturities and different acidities, because it's all picked on the same day. And it's all.
So when you talk about maturities, you're talking about vine age maturity, vines that are different ages.
Sugar levels between the different, because the different compositions of the soils, the different amount of clay, the moisture retention of each of these 3 different soils, therefore they ripen at different stages. But we choose 4 or 5 times, we'll test it over a 2-day period to try and get a great ratio of fruit, to try and get a complete sample of what we expect to get in the fermentation. And because you have something at 12.5 potential alcohol all the way to 13.8, you've got different tannin structures, different acidities, and it just happens to be one of those things that works. It just comes together. Where we have another site that we thought was going to be this great aspect, it doesn't work. There's just complete imbalance of trying to blend these different soil types together. There's a lot of luck involved.
So for me, there's a darkness, a kind of gothic density to the fruit that seems to go all the way through. Yeah, and it's like this purple, dense, dark, crazy flavor in the mid to back palate. But at the same time, you've got this juxtaposition of silky, smooth texture. I really love the interplay between those characteristics. I think it really holds together and shows so really, really well. I guess the thing about intensity that we spoke about earlier, for me, really shows in this to a large degree.
That mid-palate intensity that it has, and it carries the wine. And that, for me, is that more of that classic peacock's tail, where it just keeps delivering more and more. And you've had your first mouthful, oh, that's really interesting wine. The second time you try the wine, it's like, wow, there's more fruit coming out. Wow, there's a longer finish. By the time you finish drinking the bottle, 2 or 3 hours later, it's like, that is nothing like what I thought it tasted like an hour ago, half an hour ago.
That sort of
the way that evolves, releases is amazing.
Does that evolution in flavor, the transient characteristic in flavor, play through right through cellaring? Is it something that you experience in a 10-year-old bottling of this? Is it something that, as a characteristic, stays all the way through the life of the wine?
I think it becomes more ethereal over time.
Right.
And with the life of the wine, I think the aromas are just more present when you open the bottle. Where initially as a young wine, it definitely requires more air. Like to decant this as a young wine is absolutely ideal. To decant this wine as a 10-year-old wine, I would much prefer to see it evolve in the glass.
In the glass.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Nick.
Yes.
It's not really related to wine as such or winemaking, but Nick, I was just wondering, looking at the label Farrside, are you a fan of Gary Larson?
Absolutely. Gary Larson is not a fan of us. He was not a
That's so
in
cool.
mind when you decided on the name for the label, or?
My mother gave me his diary, his cartoon pictured diary every Christmas since I was like 8 or 9, and then it works so well with our surname. How can I not call it Farrside?
Love
it's
it.
An absolute no.
Thanks.
Has he actually raised objection? Has he actually said he's unhappy with you guys?
Yeah, no, we sent him a bottle, and he's like, "Why would you do this?"
That's fantastic.
He just made a comeback. He just came back. He just started again drawing. So,
really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't get him. I don't understand his humor. There's something wrong with me. I just don't. I've got a friend who keeps torturing me by sending me the daily cartoons since he started doing it again. And I don't understand them. It's definitely a sense of humor that I don't appreciate.
All right. Well.
All right, Nick. It's quite interesting that I guess some people would describe it as forest floor, kind of earthiness. I know that Ned Godwin wrote this huge, very emotive article when he first tasted this wine. It was a quite unusual way to write. It wasn't his normal way of writing about a wine, but I was quite attracted by what he wrote. It was really awesome. He spoke about the sort of dark, dense kind of component to wine. It definitely shows. It's beautiful.
I love, forest floor is good, but barnyard. I love how it evolves to barnyard, and this is a terrible word, but great Burgundy has feces. This off feces smell that's really attractive in the glass. It's sort of 15 to 20 years of age, and I think we seem to see that character at about 10. I think that's everything about Australian Pinot. Everything's premature. Like, we just have so much more UV. Everything deteriorates more quickly under the sun, and therefore we're seeing similar characteristics 5 to 10 years before you would in a great Burgundy.
Right. For me, I'm not seeing that Cow's RC component too much now, but there's a kind of waxiness in the phenolics that promises that that's going to come in a couple of years. It's definitely set it up for it to come through.
Hey Rob, I've got a question, a quick one. Sorry, for Nick. In this particular Tout, that tomato leaf character seems to be quite prevalent at the moment. Is that a function of fruit or stem or both?
Stem and fruit. So we try to complement the savouriness of that fruit, and that is we continue the trend of the stemminess to come through. But I've had my bottle open for the team tried it at 4 o'clock, and the fruit is starting to blossom at maybe 6:30. So like 2.5 hours it's taken for the fruit to come through on that wine and to there look far more integrated than perhaps what it would if you opened it only half an hour.
No, it's dying away in the glass really quickly, actually. But up front, it leaps out at you as the main characteristic, and then starts to mellow. It's interesting.
And people find it quite offensive to start with. They're like,
"Oh, really?
Oh, this isn't what I thought it was supposed to be." Yeah, absolutely. For people that are perhaps Mornington Pinot drinkers who want to see prettier, juicier, more fruit-driven wines, like red fruits rather than the dark spectrum that we've got. It's we get a lot of comments. So that's why I'm like, Tout is not your wine. Perhaps you should try.
Move on.
Or move on. We don't make enough to have.
You don't have to take their crap. It's so interesting hopping from the Tout into the Cote, because for me, it's now all cacao and chocolate. It's the first thing that definitely hit me by comparison to the previous, plus an intense perfume, but maybe purple perfume is a note I got, and spice, masses of spice.
Yeah, and that is because, so we've gone, Farrside is a northeast facing slope. Tout is a northeast facing slope. We're true east, and we get far more spiciness for the east facing slopes. So we need to remember that, so this 17 vintage, because as you spoke about earlier, the amount of rainfall we had, the super high natural acidity we had, this is the presence of juicy, ripe fruit is not here. This is not a typical vintage by far. There's 2 or 3 vintages every decade that we might have these sort of characteristics. And I love the fineness and the delicacy that this fruit and this acidity plays in these wines. But RP in a typical year would have this underlining spice, but this overlaying character of a lot of sort of violets and rose petal and a lot more apparent floral characteristics up front over the nose.
I think that the tannin structure for me is needlepoint fine. The delicacy of the tannin is really amazing. Here you're talking about 40 to 60% whole stems. Is that right? I think I pulled that off your site.
60% for this site. Yeah.
The Burgundians always bang on about power without weight. And for me, this shows that. It's definitely, you're in the presence of something large from a construct point of view, but there's a sense of ease and effortlessness about the wine. It's an absolute dream to drink right now. Whereas the Tout, I need to sit up straight at Sunday school and really think about it at the moment. But the Cote is just there for you right now. It's really amazing.
The simple word that I use for this is calmness. And I think we touched on this with the Cote Chardonnay that we tried a month ago. There's just this general calmness and smoothness and fineness, elegance about this wine that just makes it so pleasurable as a young wine. Yet there's so much structure and grace about it that you realise that this is going to be super drinking in 5 years.
Yeah, it's go
and they're the wines I want to make. They are the wines that I love, whether they're Burgundian, they're Oregon, Australian. The wines that have this presence about it, like, wow, that's delicious, and I cannot wait to try that wine again in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. They're the wines that reach the heights for me. It's the wines where you're like, oh, yeah, no, I can see the structure of this wine hasn't quite come together. Yeah, I'll lay it down for 5 years. They never hit the same heights as wine that's complete.
This is kind of just like leaning back in the easy chair. There's just nothing to fault it. I think that the words near perfect and what have you have been used by more than a few writers in tasting this wine, and it's truly a credit to you guys.
It's pretty special considering this vineyard's now what are we at? So this has just hit 11 years.
Yeah,
so
you'd swear it's older.
3 vintages, and the idea was to never release this wine as a single vineyard site until it was 10, maybe 15 years of age. But the level of viticulture that goes into this site is the advancement of everything that I've been able to extract from my father. So if you think about viticulture in 3 stages, we had Dad, who first started in the Marlborough Valley in the late 70s through to the 80s. Then there was sort of from about 90 to about 2001, 2002. And then the viticulture from then until about 2008. And then there's everything that we've been able to accumulate in information and source from about 2009 onwards. It just means that we're far more advanced in what we can achieve because of the knowledge that Dad started with.
Yeah.
Which was nothing.
There was an article that was once written about how you and Gary have different viewpoints often in winemaking. What are those? I'm quite intrigued to know.
That's daily disagreements to the point where I win now and he doesn't come back for a week. So I think Pinot doesn't alter that much. We're both still striving for the silkiest and most structured wine we can with absolute class from start to finish. It's Chardonnay perhaps is the variety which has transitioned the most, or even Viognier. But with Viognier, Dad was making wines that were 4 pH and 4 TA and were super rich and super oaky, and that was the conduit that he was drinking at the time. And then to transition to something that's like 12% alcohol and high acidity and looking for sort of fresh apricot rather than Gary looking for dried apricot was quite interesting. And then the Chardonnay, Dad spent a lot of time with Dominique Lafont. And those wines through Meursault were a lot of batonnage, a a lot of new oak and creaminess and fullness, and that was the 80s into the 90s. And
yeah. Well,
I
remember the Syrahs that he used to make. Creaminess was the name of the game in the ones that he made before he left there. I still to this day remember drinking one of what, in fact, it was the first Syrah I ever had that Gary had made, and I still remember that component to the wine. It was crazy. It's like yesterday. It is way different from what you guys are making today, that's for sure.
I think everyone's making better wine, but I think we're all making more restrained wines. I think that there's less manipulation because there's better understanding of what works in your site, what clones, what rootstocks, what aspects, and therefore the detail is happening in the vineyard, and there's less detail needing to be manipulated in the wineries.
Right. I'm quite interested in this close planting versus traditional planting approach. What causes you to go to the default setting of close planting in Tout a la Burgundian versus the rest of the operation, which is not? What put you in that direction for Tout to do it that way?
Definitely soil type, fertility of soil. So Farrside average bunch weight is 200 grams, 180 grams, where Tout might only be 80 to 90.
Oh,
so
okay.
You're averaging the same amount of fruit per hectare or per acre, but the amount of skin and juice ratio is far greater in Tout, and therefore there's a greater level of complexity and length in those wines because you have so much more skin, so much more contact. But there comes a point where it's high density plantings in Australia has gone nuts. Like there's people that are doing 17,000 vines per hectare, 20,000 vines per hectare, which just sounds like a nightmare. And the best thing that we've had is that Dad planted his first high density vineyard in '83 after coming back from Burgundy. And so we have this knowledge that there's a certain level of moisture and nutrients that work in our climate, and that we can have 7,000 to 8,000 vines per hectare. Yet if you're in Macedon or Mornington, you have higher rainfall, and therefore you can have 9, 10 or 11,000 vines per hectare.
Right.
So it's about trying to find that balance of canopy, fruit load, retaining natural acidity. And what we've found is that 7,500 vines per hectare works, and we get the greatest intensity. We get shaded fruit. So it's not just about how that vine grows, it's about how the vine next to it affects the fruit load on the following vine, because you have high enough canopies, therefore you get more shading of the warmer afternoon sun. And even Burgundy, talking to Jeremy at Dujac at the moment, they're looking at higher canopies. Where it used to be 1 metre of canopy, hedge it, hedge. Now they're looking to open up the canopy, looking for airflow.
To create more of that shade.
They need more shading. They seem to be more affected by climate change than what we are at the moment.
I'd say so. I guess some scary results from the Spanish about how much earlier they're harvesting. Over a 10-year period, you can see it, and you really shouldn't be seeing it over such a fast period, such a narrow period. There's no question that it's going to be a problem for everybody around the world. Those are all the questions from me. Anybody else for something else before we say goodnight to Nick? No questions? Nick, thanks so much for joining us. I know you're in the... you got one. Yeah?
One quick one. I can only see the first word on Nick's shirt, arrogance, and I'm kind of curious if there's any more.
It's fraud.
Okay.
Give it to me by a good friend in Champagne. And he's like, are you going to do Jack next week? And I said, yeah. He said, I want you to wear this jumper for the first night of dinner. And Ros says, Jacques' wife, just rolled the eyes at me. And when Ros rolls her eyes, you know you're in deep shit. And there was a lot of that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, Nick, thanks so much. We'd like to ask you to come back and talk about the 18 sometime. We'll talk to you.
We're talking about.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. Thanks so much. Good luck with the lockdown. I'm sure you guys will get through it. We're thinking about you.
Hope everyone's well and having fun. But, Melbourne's not a fun place at the moment.
Sounds like it. Look after yourselves, and we'll see you soon, mate. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.